Welcome to Pioneer Cemetery in Auburn, Washington. I am here cleaning a grave. It's got quite a bit of moss on it. It rains 9 months out of the year here in the Pacific Northwest, so headstones get kind of moss covered and there's a lot of lichen sometimes, so it's good to every now and then scrub them down and make them shiny and sparkly clean again. I'm going to tell you a little bit about this couple here that I am helping out today. It is Natsuo Shimasaki, who was born in 1887, and his wife Utoro Shimasaki, who was born in 1885 in Japan. And I apologize for butchering those names. From here on out, I'm just going to call them Mr. and Mrs. Shimasaki so that I don't continue to embarrass them or myself. Let's see, shortly after Mr. Shimasaki came to America from Japan, he married his childhood friend, Mrs. Shimasaki, who had also come to America in 1902 at the age of 17. Mr. Shimasaki was very active in the Auburn Japanese community. He taught himself to read, write, and speak English, and acted as an interpreter for many Japanese American families in the area. In 1918, as America entered the First World War, Mr. Shimasaki registered for the draft. The couple was farming in Auburn, what was known as Christopher at the time. It wasn't called Auburn then, but they already had 4 children, 2 sons and a daughter, and his wife was expecting their 4th child at that time in World War I. Let's see, in 1920, the census indicates that the family was renting their home. At the time, Japanese were not allowed to own land because of discriminatory laws that were in effect at that time. The family worked on a berry farm. They were doing very well for themselves, enough so, in fact, that in 1922, the family was able to take a trip to Japan to visit their relatives, including Mrs. Shimasaki's mother. The couple took their 2 youngest children on the trip with them. By the time the census taker again visited the Shimasaki family in 1930, Mr. and Mrs. Shimasaki had added another son and 4 more daughters to their family. So they had quite the large family. They continued working as truck farmers and clearly emphasized the importance of their children's education. By 1940, no fewer than 3 of their children, William, Lillian, and Mary, had been named as valedictorians of their respective graduating classes at Auburn High School. The autumn of 1940 provided Mrs. Shimasaki with another opportunity to travel back to Japan. That year marked the 2600th year celebration of the founding of the Japanese Empire. A Seattle travel agent took this opportunity to organize a tour group that ultimately included many Japanese from Western Washington, including Mrs. Shimasaki. And unfortunately, after the bombing of Pearl Harbor in 1941, which was just a year later, those who had traveled with this tour group to observe the imperial celebrations came under the suspicion by the FBI. Although the participants testified that their primary interest in taking the tour had been to visit aging relatives in Japan, the Bureau was convinced that the trip was instead a means to help Japan plot expansion into the United States. The FBI concluded that participation in the trip was evidence of stronger loyalty to the Japanese emperor than to the government of the United States. Several of the tour participants were arrested and transported to Fort Missoula in Montana, where they had to endure hearings to explain their actions and intentions. Although Mrs. Shimasaki escaped that fate, her and her family, like so many of their neighbors, were later forcibly removed to the internment camp at Two Lake, California. It's in Northern California. The Two Lake War Relocation Center, which is later known as the Two Lake Segregation Center, was a high-security internment camp in Northern California for Japanese Americans, including those that were U.S. citizens. A total of 29,840 individuals were incarcerated at Two Lake over the lifetime of the camp's operation. In order to take care of so many people, The authorities instilled the incarcerates as employees, like doctors, farmers, teachers, and even store clerks. Essentially, the camp became a town that included a couple of Buddhist temples. And it looked like a town, and everyone was operating accordingly. There were a few disgruntled members that were not getting paid properly for their services. Even though it looked like a town, it was still a camp, and individuals were not allowed to leave. At some point in 1946, this camp did close down. It was the last to close, I believe, out of all the camps across the U.S. I haven't been able to find any death records of the Shimasaki couple, but they're buried here in Washington years after the camp closed, so they made it back home at some point. Of the 300 families that were relocated to that camp from Washington, there were only 25 families that made it back. So those families that were relocated to California never made it home. And a lot of these burial sites in this cemetery were abandoned and no longer taken care of once these families were moved on. Today, their Buddhist temple is the one that takes care of the headstones specifically, and the Auburn City Parks Department takes care of the landscaping. This has truly been an honor to clean their burial spot and learn about this amazing couple. I enjoy learning about their history and just really understanding what these people went through in the 1800s and having respect and being humbled by that. The two photos that I did include, the black and white photos, were from the National Park Service, and thank you to them for allowing me to use that. Anyway, I hope that you can join me again, and I appreciate you taking the time to learn and enjoy this day with me. We'll talk to you guys all soon.